Hey guys, so today I'm going to talk to you about how I took this beautiful piece of ironbark eucalyptus from Street Tree Revival and turned it into my first ever fine woodworking project, which is going to be an electronic standing desk epoxy river table. First things first, you just got to clean the wood up. Essentially, you just want to take all of the soft bark, soft wood from the edges off, because we're going to be cutting this in half and flipping it over and putting the epoxy in the middle. You want a nice solid base for the epoxy to stick to, and any of that soft wood is going to be a potential breaking hazard for it. I tried this with just a chisel and it was not awesome, so I got this wire brush, which I've seen people use on other YouTube videos, and it worked really well. Highly recommended. I got this track saw as well for my handsaw. It's just a track, and you'll see later on it has some issues, but it got the job done. Just not as straight as I wanted it to be, kind of flimsy here and there. As you can see right there, I made a missed cut, but just cutting it in half right there, we're going to put the river right in the middle. So what I'm doing now is creating the mold. It's got this piece of MDF, which is great because we know it's really flat since it's totally factory. And now I'm just going to lay down my wood and measure out where I'm going to put the side panels. Those side panels are going to help keep all of the epoxy inside. Now, if you're doing a full epoxy table, you definitely want to create lateral panels as well. I fortunately got away without doing them on this project. Just to be safe, I would probably do it on the next one. And here I'm just laying out some tape. The epoxy is going to stick to that MDF like crazy, like impossible to get off crazy. So you need that tape. You can also use, like whiteboard wood or whatever, but you just want a non-stick surface. I ran out of that clear tape, and I wanted a better tape as well, so I got this red tuck tape online, and it worked awesome. And here I'm just going to check my fitting for my wood. I want to make sure it's perfectly set in there for this project, and I'm going to caulk all of the edges. Right now I'm laying down caulking dam on the underside, and as you'll see later on, it did definitely help, but it wasn't the best solution. And this being my first project, I thought that would be a great way to go. So now I took my clamps and I clamped it down nice and tight to create a seal so that the epoxy doesn't leak out. You have to remember this epoxy is as thin as water, and it'll find any way out. So I am caulking the edges on the front, and I also caulk the edges on the back, and I'm doing the same for the other side. Just a double dam underneath, and then caulking either side of it as well. What I'm doing here is just measuring the distance from the outsides, making sure they're nice and even. Couple reasons: I don't have that much epoxy, and epoxy is super expensive, so you want to make sure that your measurements are going to add up nice, so that you don't have any epoxy wasting, and you have enough to finish the job. And here, as I'm caulking the inside, you can see that it gets a little messy on the ridges of the where the bark used to be, but I cleaned it up as much as possible, and most of it's going to be on the bottom side anyway, and we're going to plane it down, so I'm not super worried about that showing through the epoxy. Since wood is porous, we want to just throw down a little coat of polyurethane or sealer. This is going to help the epoxy to not seep in. I'm just cleaning up all the excess here. And I also scuffed it up with a wire brush a little bit, and what that's going to do is just give it more area for the epoxy to cling to. And since we're going to try and fill it up all the way to the top, creating these dams on top with the caulking, and that's just going to help keep any overflow in. As you can see, I have that really cool little ridge there on the outside, so making a little dam for it around there too. Now, epoxy is kind of a really particular thing that you need to make, so you need to mix it exactly right, timing wise and volume or weight-wise, depending on the epoxy. Since I took measurements and I need 2.7 gallons, I'm just going to mix all 3 gallons that I have. This first batch is 1.5 gallons. That's the resin right there, and then this is the hardener. Just an A to B 2-to-1 solution, and it calls for it to be mixed for 4 minutes. So I just took my little mixing head and drill and mixed it up. You want to grab a paint scraper and scrape the bottom and the edges, making sure that you're getting a great mix on all of this. A lot of people recommend that you transfer it. So 20 seconds in here on my 4-minute mix. If you do transfer it, it's obviously a great way to make sure that you've gotten everything off the bottom. I didn't have another clean bucket. Now here at about 1.5 minutes, I decided to mix my pigment in. I just got this mica pigment from online, black with metallic flakes in it. And I had no idea how much to use. Nobody gives you like a direct measurement. Some people and some epoxies have guidelines, but I had this small little guy, so I wanted to make sure I had enough for both batches. So I just decided to throw in 2 tablespoons, and honestly, I was really happy with it. Everybody says it is kind of guesswork until you really feel it out and you know how much you want, what color you want. That amount gave me a nice translucency though. That's really great. And here you can see just pouring it in kind of nice and slowly. You want to mitigate as many bubbles as possible, but we're going to go back and pop as many as we can anyway. And here, this is a little trick I saw on another YouTube channel. Just kind of brushing the edges. It's going to get all the bubbles that have clung to the sides off. And then we're going to go over with our heat gun. A lot of people use torches, which would be great. I just don't have one and didn't feel like going back to the big box store to get one, because I think for this project I went there about, 80 times. But this guy worked really well. It's just an electronic heat gun for like electric projects that I used to rewire my motorcycle. And it's on the high setting and it did really well. As you can see, super glossy. Not a bubble in sight. Now back for the second pour. Again, I measured out about 2.7 gallons when I did my cubic measurements, and that's a pretty simple way to measure actually. Unfortunately, I don't have a video of it, but you really just take a volume measurement, and it's super easy. So I used all 3 gallons, and I had a little left over to make a cool paperweight. There, what you just saw was me kind of evening it out. I had already taken level measurements, but it wasn't as level as I wanted it to be. And this is my sister's turkey baster that worked great for filling in these little spots and throwing in a little extra epoxy to get it all the way up to the edge. It is toast now, so I do owe my sister a turkey baster. Again, going back and just getting all those bubbles that have clung to the sides. And back the heat gun again. I could have poured it all in the 3-gallon batch, but I decided to do it half and half. This kind of helped me control the bubbles a little bit more, I think. And frankly, this was an incredibly stressful process. I've heard about how fickle epoxy is, and I just was afraid to mix such a large batch at the first go. Now here what I'm doing is just kind of taking my brush and creating a design. I had no idea how the mica pigment was going to react in the epoxy or how it was going to look after all. So I just decided to swirl it around and kind of play with it, and this is what it looks like after that. But after a few hours, when the resin and the hardener were starting to settle the epoxy, it actually started to look more like this, kind of separating into blotches. And then an hour or two later, it looked more like this, which was really cool, kind of like lava. I was really happy with it. And after 3 days, we took it off the mold.
Like I was saying, you can see all of this leakage. Well, fortunately, I caulked the edges here and didn't get too much out. But what we want to do is just flatten all of the surfaces, make it perfectly even and flat, especially since we have some of these divots here in the river, which probably came from the leakage, but we're just going to slice it down. So we need something that's perfectly flat. So I just cleaned the MDF that we used for the mold So again, we want to make sure it's perfectly straight, so I'm using the MDF as a foundation. And then I got these aluminum angle bars, which are going to be perfectly straight. I'm just going to screw them onto the MDF on the outside. It's going to give us a nice base to run our jig on. And then I saw this cool jig on YouTube, smaller angle bars, aluminum too. Basically just going to put a piece of wood in between them, and it's going to fit my router perfectly. And we have a perfectly flat surface to run the router, the planer over. All right, so we'll get started.
So again, I saw this planer jig for a router online, and it looked really cool. Looked super efficient and easy. But frankly, I thought that it was going to do a lot better job of flattening and leveling my table more than it did. As you'll see, though, it was really efficient for what I needed it for. It just wasn't the final process of planing this piece of wood. But what it did do is get out all of these big divots on the edges and give me a nice solid base to go back to the planer and get it as flat and even as possible. So as you'll see, I did take it to an industrial planer over at R&D Construction down there in Anaheim by Street Tree Revival, where I got the wood. They had recommended him to me. He does do epoxy tables. Not a lot of industrial drum sanders or belt sanders are going to take epoxy tables, so just call around if you need to. I was fortunate. I was down to the wire for my deadline on this one, and I was freaking out because after planing it, my wood looked like this. It was covered in burns. It wasn't level. I had random holes in it. So this is the drum sander that I took it to. Super cool. It's a 80 grit, 120 grit, and then a 220 grit, just huge belt sanders, and it made the wood look absolutely beautiful after it. And then I assembled my electronic standing desk base. It isn't actually the one that I really wanted, but I am actually happy with it a lot. It's a single motor. I wanted a dual motor, but it works great. Now I'm just cutting it down to final size, and this is where the track that I bought really gave me some troubles. I could not for the life of me get it straight, and frankly my handsaw is kind of a cheap one, so it was wobbling a little bit. And at the end of the day, if I were to do this project again, I would invest in a track saw, like a real nice track saw. This is a 3-inch hole that I cut for the outlets that I'm going to put into it. I was kind of wavering on that a little bit because I wanted it to look solid and pretty, but I also wanted it to be utilitarian. So at the end of the day, the outlet in there is great. Now we're just sanding it. This was hours and hours of sanding it. I saw on a YouTube channel that throwing a damp rag over it in between sanding cycles is going to really make the grain pop, and I think it was great. And it was really nice to be able to see the final product, as it was getting more closer to done. And I went all the way up to 800 grit, and then I buffed it with just an auto buff, and it made it look fantastic. As you can see, the shine on it, it's really nice. Now, it's not here, but I'm going to cover this desk in Rubio monocoat. But even without that monocoat, it still looks beautiful. And it's just not totally protected, and it's not as shiny and glossy as it will be in the final product. But after assembling it to the legs, it worked really well. It looked amazing, and the client was happy. And that client was my mother. I built this for her birthday, and it turned out really well.